Let's try that one more time.
Sure.
I had everything muted. So,
Oh,
okay, we'll try again. So, hello everybody. Hope that you're doing well today. I have a great guest today. This is Dr. Libby Hausrath from the UNLV Department of Geosciences. She is one of the scientists on the Mars mission and is one of the people who's most important in moving the center of gravity of science from the East Coast to the Mojave Desert. Okay, so Libby, go ahead and introduce yourself again and tell us who you are and how you got here.
great. Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here. So as Jason said, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Geoscience at UNLV. I study water-rock interactions. So what happens when liquid water interacts with the minerals in rocks, and what can happen to those interactions when life is present. For example, the plants and microorganisms present in soils and in other types of environments. And so I study that on Earth and also on Mars. And so right now I am on one of the return sample scientists on the Mars 2020 rover Perseverance. And so we are interested in selecting the samples that will be returned to Earth for analysis here in Earth's laboratories.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, how is it different? How do you study water on Mars, like water interactions with the soils on Mars, and how does that compare with how you would study them on the Earth?
That's a great question. So we can look, obviously there is no current liquid water stable on the surface of Mars. So what we look at are the minerals that result from those past interactions. And so there are different kinds of data from Mars. So we can look at orbital data, which is remote sensing of the surface. So that tells you in some locations there might be, more clay minerals or more sulfates. The sort of the global distribution of minerals from orbit on Mars. The rovers, depending on which instruments they have on them, can give you mineralogy and geochemistry of the minerals. And again, you can use those to infer past aqueous conditions. And of course, meteorites are a great way to look at samples from Mars. And now soon, relatively soon, in addition to the meteorites, we will have samples selected by people in context where we have measurements of their environment to be able to look at these questions for Mars.
Okay, how common are Martian meteorites?
Not very common. So I don't know the exact number. I think it's something over 100. Obviously, Dr. Ari Udry is the Martian meteorite specialist here.
I'll be talking to her sometime soon. She doesn't know it yet, but I'll be talking to her soon.
Yeah. Yeah, she's the expert on Martian meteorites here, and so she'd probably be able to tell you that with more precision. But there aren't that many, and we have to take what we get in terms of meteorites, in terms of what has been blasted off the surface and collected here on Earth. And so we've learned so much from the Martian meteorites that gives us a sense of what we can learn from samples that will be collected, in context and selected for future study.
Okay, so we should probably jump right into it since so the current Mars 2020 mission, is that the ongoing name? Is that the name forever?
I think people are calling it Perseverance. I mean, Perseverance is its name, so okay. Yeah.
Okay, so the Perseverance, it's a rover and it has some kind of canister on it. How is the sample collection going to proceed?
That's a great question. So the rover will it also has a bunch of scientific instruments. So it has the ability to take pictures and analyze chemical and mineralogical data, as well as the presence of organic molecules, which of course are important because organic molecules are one of the best signatures of life on Earth. And so it has the ability to take these measurements and then either drill a rock sample or collect a sample of soil or regolith, basically, seal them in a tube, and then those caches will be deposited on the Martian surface for return to Earth in by a future mission.
Okay, now when you have, how big is the search radius that you'll be able to do? What's the plan for the Mars mission in terms of how far it can go and over what period of time can it go that far?
That's a great question. So it is currently in Jezero Crater, and so it is traversing across. Well, first the helicopter is going to fly, and then after that, it will be traversing across the crater, and then up out of the crater into Neoplanum, which is the area around Jezero Crater. And so the goal is to be able to analyze and sample both of the area within Jezero Crater, which used to be a lake, and then the area outside, which has very ancient rocks, very ancient mineral sequences that indicate really interesting things about the past climate of Mars. And both of them have the possibility to preserve evidence of potential past life if it was present.
Okay, so that gives you also, because you'll be going up like a crater rim, you'll be able to sample like both kind of what it was like at the bottom of the lake and then at different shoreline levels or something like that, presumably, as you go up. And if you only have, how many total samples can you collect, and then how will you know that you didn't waste one of your slots?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the number for return is thought to be about 31. And then the number that will be collected is 43. And so there are some, extras. And so, but that's a really hard question. I mean, every time you go in the field on Earth, you want to collect everything, and you can't do that. You can't do that on Earth, and you certainly can't do it on Mars. And so the task of, prioritizing and selecting is a big one. And luckily, the rover has the ability to make a lot of measurements. And so as we go, we can make, chemical and mineralogical measurements and be confident that, we're collecting a sample that will answer the types of scientific questions we anticipate when we get back.
Okay, so does that mean that the rover itself is going to keep all of these samples on board until you down select to the final 24? Or how do you get from the 30? How do you get from, I guess, the 40 something down to the 30 something?
So the thought is currently to probably put one cache in Jezero Crater, and then one cache that has some of the samples from Jezero Crater outside Jezero Crater. And so that way, that's sort of insurance, if anything goes, wrong with the rover, there's already the samples cached. And so that's some of the extra will probably go into developing those two different caches.
Okay, so they're actually going to be hidden on the surface, or probably as much in plain sight as possible on the surface.
Right.
And would the future mission to pick them up, would it have to go to both sites, or would you choose? How would that work? The sample return mission, because that's
it'll probably only choose one. So it'll pick one and return that sample cache.
Okay, and then presumably if it goes well, then they can send another one and pick up the second.
Yeah, we'll see. I think I haven't heard anyone talk about that, but the plan is to pick up one one cache for return.
Okay. Excuse me. And is most of the interest, so I know that you're helping select, if I understand correctly, which what samples to take. What are the other competing science agendas that are going into this decision?
So there's basically this rover has a really big a goal ahead of it, which is to collect all kinds of data as well as the samples. And so it has really great instruments for measuring the like I said, the chemistry and the mineralogy and the organic molecules. And so we'll be able to learn. We're already learning information right now about the surface of Mars, and so that contributes to the ability to collect samples, and also stands on its own as really valuable information coming back. And so in terms of the priorities within the sample collection, that's something that people have been working on for years developing what are the the really high priority questions that can be answered with these samples. Questions about potential past presence of life, the past climate history of Mars, the igneous processes, what has Mars been like as a planet over its history. And so those questions are relatively well developed, the hypotheses that can be tested, and there's a framework for essentially sort of a planned cache that we can work on collecting as we drive along.
And how deep when you take a sample, how deep could you go potentially with a core, for example?
Let's see, I think it's about 10 centimeters. So it's about the size of a piece of chalk. They're pretty small, but when you think about being able to analyze them here on Earth using things like synchrotron techniques and so forth, we'll be able to do all kinds of measurements on these materials once they're back.
Okay. And so how many people get to select, like what's the sample selection committee look like? I assume it's some kind of committee. And what role will you be playing in that?
So they're the return sample scientists, of which I'm one, and then there's also a return sample science working group, and also the wisdom and the scientific expertise of the whole team is leveraged in collecting these samples. So the whole team can weigh in on their interests and what they think about the sample. So this is really going to be leveraging the expertise of the entire team. Yeah, exactly.
So I remember being on the Kepler mission that there were often a lot of discussions about, well, one of the first questions that we had after the spacecraft went up was the spacecraft was designed to be defocused so that instead of having all the light concentrated on single pixels, because then if there's a mistake on that or like some kind of noise that happens in that pixel, then it ruins the image. And so if you spread it out, then you're less susceptible to some kind of systematic effects. But so the spacecraft went up and everything was functioning, but then the question was, do we really want to defocus, or do we want to stick with it the way that it currently is working? Because it's working now, and if we touch this knob, then who knows what's going to happen. And so that was a decision that they basically sent around to everybody on the science team asking, okay, do we go with it? And everyone said, yeah, I mean, we sent the mission up there for a reason. Let's try to trust the engineers that they did a good job in the design. And so there were a lot of those kinds of discussions in the science team meetings. Do the science team meetings, when you get together, or at least in the future when you get together, is that going to be also on Mars time, or?
It's on Mars time right now. So right now, the science discussions and the campaign implementation discussions, which each alternate. So one day, every other day, there's a science discussion, and every other day, there's a campaign implementation discussion. Those are on Mars time, so they're rotating through the clock. So that's interesting. But yeah, so you have you have experience with these large teams where everyone's expertise is leveraged and included as much as possible. I think it's really valuable.
And so Mars time is, how much does that slip relative to Earth time?
About 40 minutes per day.
Okay.
And so the Mars day is 40 minutes longer, so every day it gets 40 minutes later Mars time relative to Earth time. How
do people do that? Is there an app for that? Like, how do you know where you land?
There is an app. I'm not 100% on Mars time. I'm sort of, balancing sort of what I can in terms of, luckily we have a lot of European colleagues on the mission. And so they're often able to, do some of the overnight, what's daytime for them and is overnight for us, and vice versa. So many of us are on sort of partial Mars time.
Okay. So it is, I remember when it first happened with Spirit and Opportunity, where they had, it was basically like everyone was awake all the time is what it seemed like. But just the idea of having your clock shift by a time zone almost, time zone every other day for a decade, is that the plan?
Oh, no, it's usually only the first 90 days. So so people are on Mars time usually for the first 90 days, and then it goes to Earth time. So that's when it's like really, everything is being done for the first time, and it's very intense, and there's a lot of pressure. But then after that, it you're able to do most days, and they worked really hard for this, for perseverance, to shorten the period of time, to automate more things, so that the time between when you get the data down and when you send the plan up can be short enough that
you can get
windows. That done most days. Yeah, exactly, in the window. So it's a shorter window now than on any other mission. So yeah, it won't be. This is a short-term thing, because it's brutal.
So
people who are 100% on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you basically need to exercise the protocols to make the decisions and upload. Tell the rover what to do. How fast does the rover move when it's moving?
Gosh, I'm probably, let's see. I feel like, so the number that's springing to mind is something like 20 meters per day, but I probably even shouldn't say that. It really depends a lot
on the terrain.
Yeah. But because on some days it doesn't drive at all. For example, when the helicopter is flying, the rover is not going to be moving at all.
Mm-hmm.
And then on some days it drives basically the whole day and does only science that can be done while it's driving. And then on some days, it might, drive for a little bit and do some science. So it really depends. It is obviously one of the top priorities is keeping the rover healthy. And so, there's a lot of, concern to make sure that it stays healthy and avoids any, hazards in its way, that sort of thing.
With how many different instruments are on the spacecraft, and I guess how big is the team? Because the science, the sample return is a portion of the mission,
right?
But how big of a portion is it compared to the rest of the mission?
There are several hundred people, I don't know, associated with the various instruments. And then, of course, there are a lot of engineers associated with the rover. So the team itself is hundreds and hundreds of people. And so the return sample folks and the participating scientists are a small fraction of that team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with the participating scientist program, so that's how you joined the mission, was through the participating scientist program? Okay, because that's how I got into Kepler, and that's also how Jason Barnes got onto Cassini, was through the participating scientist program. And I've described it in the past as like, people think about these missions for decades, but you can't always anticipate everything that you'll learn in the meantime, and so they bring in fresh people to take all the glory as the because now the instrument's ready to go, and the mission transitions from a development thing to implementation, and so the personnel that you need to leverage what you have needs to change a little bit. So with that, so comparing, how does the stuff that you study on the Earth, let's talk a little bit about what you study on the Earth, and then we'll compare it to what you anticipate with the samples that you're both looking at, and then the samples that will be coming back. So when you study the things on the Earth, say again what it is that you're looking at when you're looking at Earth systems.
We use a combination of lab experiments, field work, and modeling, basically to interpret water-rock interactions, what happens when minerals interact with fluids, particularly the rates at which those reactions occur. So how minerals dissolve, how they precipitate, how that contributes to the formation of soils and sediments, and the composition of waters, and that. So, and we're interested in the presence of life, like I said. So sometimes we include microorganisms in those experiments, or organic acids as proxies for biological impacts, to see what happens in those interactions. Because of course on Earth, life is everywhere, impacting nearly everything.
So how would that change? Like, say you have a rock and then you put it in a swimming pool. What will change in that rock, or like some mineral? It
dissolves. So some quickly dissolving minerals will preferentially dissolve. That will change the solution chemistry. So the ions that go into solution, that'll change the pH as it dissolves, some of the ions will probably reprecipitate in another form, so maybe a rock coating or a clay mineral, a secondary phase of some sort. If there's life there, then some of the nutrients will probably be taken up by the life. It might also contribute to, microorganisms have a very high surface area, so it might contribute to precipitation on the surfaces, or preferential solubilization, depending on the organic compounds that are present.
Does the interaction with water depend upon like the type of rock that you have, like an igneous versus a sedimentary versus a metamorphic rock? What are the differences that one would see depending on the type of rock you start with?
So some minerals are much more susceptible to liquid water than others. And so, for example, olivine dissolves much more rapidly and is more soluble than, for example, quartz. And that's why, beach sands, for example, are primarily quartz, the white sand beaches.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, some places where you have a lot of volcanic activity and that's close, for example, you can get the green olivine sand beaches in Hawaii that result. So there, where you're very close to the volcano and it hasn't had a chance to dissolve, you can have the green sand beaches, for example, that you don't see in the rest of the world. So the mineralogy matters a lot.
So when you have a volcano that's producing your beach for you, you'll start with a particular color, and then that gets like leached, like the minerals that have a variety of color will get leached out of it, and then you're left over with the quartz. Is that kind of?
Yeah.
You get
So
Florida
quartz
in the end?
is very resistant. Yeah, quartz is very resistant. And so as the, on most beaches, you have material being broken down from the continent in general, being transported down by rivers. And then as that breaks down, it dissolves, or as the sediment is transported, it dissolves. And the more, basically susceptible minerals are broken down. So what you're left with is quartz, which is very persistent.
So that's interesting. That means that if the beach were ever to come up into like the farmland of the Midwest, the shoreline would over time change colors from the brown, like fertile soil that you would plant your wheat in. The stuff that dissolves would eventually be carried out into the ocean. And so that's
with additional water you'd see impacts, definitely.
And so some waters are pretty porous. I mean, you see, like when you go to Zion National Park, you'll see like water leaching out of the sandstone. With the rocks that we're expecting on Mars, how would those rocks compare to rocks on the Earth? Like what would we be looking at, or is there a way to say these are the kinds of rocks we have on the Earth and we see similar rocks on Mars and therefore we'll see similar processes, or are the rocks somewhat different on Mars?
Yeah, so Mars is largely a basaltic planet. So it's largely made out of basalts, which are more iron and magnesium rich than, for example, granites, which are common on Earth's continents. Although there is increasing evidence for more variability in the Martian lithologies than previously thought, and that's something you should ask Dr. Arya Udry about, because she's looking into that, what the different compositions of the igneous rocks are. And then there's also substantial sedimentary rocks on Mars, but in contrast to Earth, the sedimentary rocks are largely made out of sediments of basaltic composition. So again, sandstones on Earth are often made out of materials like quartz that are more silica rich, whereas the similar sedimentary rocks on Mars tend to be more iron and magnesium rich, made out of basaltic material, which makes sense since it's a basaltic planet.
Do the sedimentary rocks on Mars, do they originate primarily from wind erosion and settling, or is it former water, or I guess you get some mixture of both? But
yeah, both probably. Yeah, there's certainly former Aeolian dunes that are now sandstones. There's also, mudstones. So there are sedimentary rocks deposited by water and also by wind.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then going back to the Earth with when you have life, is there life? So what does life do to transform the rock, and how does life even persist if it's embedded? I mean, I can imagine life crawling around on the surface, but it's hard to imagine life kind of permeating something. So what are the weird places that life can exist, and then how does that affect the geology of?
Yeah, well, soils, of course, are teeming with life, plants and microorganisms and so forth. And a lot of the organic material comes from the surface into the soil. People are very interested in looking at life that might be completely separated from photosynthesis. So I don't know if you know Dr. Dwayne Moser at DRI. He looks at deep life that's found very very far beneath the surface that might be separated from photosynthesis. And then there's also life found just beneath the surface. It's called endoliths, so it lives in rocks that can still be photosynthetic. So if the light is somewhat if the rock is somewhat transparent to light, then you can still have life living in the rock just beneath the surface. And Dr. Henry Sun at DRI does a lot of work on that as well. So really, there's life living in all kinds of extreme environments. So very acidic conditions, very hot conditions, very dry conditions, very cold conditions. There's a lot of extreme extremophiles, they're called.
Yeah. Okay. So then, but you're saying that the majority of stuff that is it true? The majority of stuff that you've looked at is the interaction of life with the soils. So the things kind of on the surface where, and what are some of the things that you find when you look at the interaction of life with, the soils on the surface? How does the Mojave compare to someplace else? Because the Mojave is really the only place I care about to first order.
So desert soils are really different from soils in wetter environments, because in wetter environments, essentially the rain and precipitation flush out a lot of the ions, so you get a lot of leaching, where what you have left is what's left behind when you dissolve things. And obviously this is on a continuum where tropical soils are much more heavily leached and weathered than more temperate soils. In desert soils, you don't have enough precipitation to do that, so you actually get a buildup of material like calcium carbonate. So like the caliche layers, if you probably you've tried to dig in your garden and you get to a very hard layer.
Yeah, I was warned against trying to dig anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Why none of us have basements here. That's the buildup of calcium carbonate, because there isn't enough water to leach that out. So in other places that gets leached away and doesn't form.
Oh, so how does it form in the first place? Just, is it biology that's produced all the caliche that we have here?
It's basically the lack of water. So it's the evaporation relative to the amount of precipitation.
Oh wow. Okay, so where there's more rain, you're going to get basically softer soils and places where you can. A friend of mine. So we lived in Chicago before we moved here, and he said he first moved in, and a neighbor was going to plant a tree. And he's like, okay, so he scheduled his time to go to help plant the tree, and he showed up with his pickaxe and a bunch of other things. He was expecting to spend like 4 hours digging the hole to plant the tree, and they were done in like 20 minutes. Because he had moved from Las Vegas, where planting a tree was like a whole day endeavor, where the whole neighborhood came out to help.
Right.
And so that's I never anticipated that's a consequence of the desert environment that that it doesn't get removed from the soils like it would somewhere else. And so it persists. That's an effect that would persist basically everywhere from California over to the middle of Texas, then everywhere in the Southwest and northern Mexico and stuff.
Yep.
And then when life interacts with the soils, how does it change? What are some new additional changes that come because of the presence of life?
So often the presence of carbon dioxide. So plant roots and microorganisms release carbon dioxide as part of their respiration. So that changes the pH of the soil and makes it more acidic. The plants also release organic compounds, so that provides food basically for microorganisms. Microorganisms catalyze chemical reactions. So where you have essentially oxygen seeping into the soil from the surface, and then gradually the oxygen gets used up by the organic matter, and you in that redox transition where you have oxidants and reductants, microorganisms catalyze those reactions and make them go faster in whatever environment. So they might contribute to oxidation of iron in rocks that causes them to expand, for example, and other types of reactions.
Okay, so if we consider the fact that most of the rocks on Mars are going to be these iron-rich ones, how would the presence of life manifest itself in the Martian surface as opposed to the Earth's surface?
That's a great question, and that's sort of the big question, right? And so one of the ways to determine the past presence of life is organic compounds. So life as we know it is made out of carbon, and so there are some very persistent organic compounds on Earth that are used to give information about the history of life on Earth. And so looking for those types of organic compounds on Mars is one way to look for the past presence of life. And along with that, there are sort of multiple types of biosignatures. So in addition to organic compounds, there's isotopic signatures, there's macro and micro structures and morphologies, so shapes, as well as geochemistry and mineralogy. And so one way to really strongly, obviously, detecting life will be an extraordinary claim, and there will be, the need for lots of evidence. And so having multiple lines of evidence to support that idea would be multiple types of biosignatures.
Okay. Now, what are the isotopic effects? Like, how would life change the isotopic content of something?
That's a great question. And so that's actually, something that is particularly with non-traditional isotopes, which I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Shishun Huang's work, looking at non-traditional isotopes. For example, of iron, there are signatures if an organism preferentially takes up a lighter, heavier isotope, then that can potentially persist in the rock record.
Okay, so you could imagine, like, if there's a bacteria colony or something like that, that you might have a region in your sample that has a different ratio of iron 56 to iron 60 or something like that. Is that
right? Yeah, exactly.
That's it. Because usually I guess historically, up until 2 minutes ago, I always imagined that for the most part, chemistry was chemistry, and that these isotopic effects are hard to separate. That's why if you want to make a uranium bomb or something like that, you have to go through a physical process to separate them, because chemically they're essentially the same. But this shows that what it shows is that the energy of interaction of life is, if you want to have a more efficient process, so that maybe 5% difference in mass between two different isotopes would save the organism the trouble of having to metabolize something that's a little bit heavier, or something along those lines.
Yeah, exactly. So there can definitely be, those types of isotopic signatures. Yep.
Okay, so that's really interesting. Now, how long is the Mars mission going to last, and what role will you be playing? Is your role going to evolve much throughout the mission? And then I guess, what's the calendar going forward? So it just barely landed. Everyone's going to be awake so 2 months from now you'll be able to take a nap.
Right. So the prime mission is 3 years now, and my understanding is that the samples need to be and all of this is contingent on lots of things, but the samples need to be in place by 2028, and so for return. And so like right now, my role is this 3-year prime mission, but my hope is that the rover stays healthy and able to do all of its tasks for a long time, like many other similar past rovers, like MSL Curiosity, which is doing great, and the MER rovers, which did great for such long times.
A lot longer than what they were spec'd for.
Right.
Unlike the Kepler mission, which lasted 6 months longer than it was spec'd, and then it was funny because it was right when I was applying for jobs and I was like, oh, Kepler's, it's running great, we have lots of fuel, and then the reaction wheel failed, and it was right in the middle of one of my interviews when the reaction wheel.
Oh no.
So, but yeah, certainly there have been many success stories. I mean, I think Spirit and Opportunity really broke the mold in terms of.
It's amazing. I mean, I just cannot say enough good things about JPL engineers. I mean, it is just, like the idea of getting a rover on another planet and then like having it be able to do these things, like it's mind blowing. I mean, it's just absolutely mind blowing, right? Like when Perseverance landed and there was that image on the surface, it's like amazing, just amazing.
Yeah, it was. So something that's interesting over the course of the last, I guess almost 30 years now that missions have been landing on the surface. Missions with rovers have been landing on the surface. Because I remember when Pathfinder landed, that it was the technology for landing the spacecraft had to change from one iteration to the next, because Pathfinder was in that tetrahedron, and it bounced around on the surface with a bunch of airbags and then opened up. And then they got too heavy for that. And so they're like, okay, we've got to figure out another way to get things to land. Do you know the difference between, did Spirit and Opportunity, I don't think they landed the same way that the Mars Science Lab and Mars 2020 or Perseverance landed, right? How did?
Right. Yeah. So MSL landed, was the first time to land that way with the Sky Crane, where it's, it's
the hovering platform that.
Right, it's dropped to the surface, and then you probably saw the like beautiful, images and video of that from Mars 20 from Perseverance, which is, I mean, it's incredible to be able to do that. Like, it's just amazing. So,
do you remember how Spirit and Opportunity landed? What did they do that was different?
I don't. I should know. I don't remember how they landed.
That's something I'll have to look up for.
Yeah.
To see how that goes. All right. Are you willing to take some questions?
Sure.
Okay, let's see what we've got. We have, I'm looking to the side because this is where I have the chat pulled up. Are we looking for just microbial life on Mars? Will the cores reveal evidence of plant life like loam or coal deposits, something similar to that? And is there evidence, so is it only, are people primarily anticipating microbial life, or could there be some kind of equivalent of plant life?
Well, I mean, we'll be looking at everything. So we'll be looking at all the chemistry and all the organic molecules. I think microbial life is anticipated to be the most likely, but certainly if there were a plant life, for example, then it would be, I think it would, it would be observed by the instruments, and certainly in the samples.
Where would those things diverge? Like, could you tell the difference between life that ate its way to health or life that used photosynthesis?
So let's see.
I don't know where the boundary is drawn between those two.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. So there's concern in general about photosynthesis about Mars because there's so much radiation on the surface, and so much UV. So, and it's so cold now, and so the probably, and because the UV and the radiation break down organic compounds, so evidence of past life would likely be preserved in the rocks.
Like subsurface.
And so, yeah. And so that's, people are interested in metabolisms that can be separated from photosynthesis. And so, anything, anything that's there that's detectable will be detected.
Right. Okay. So what you're saying is, because Mars doesn't have a magnetic field, so there's no Van Allen radiation belts, there's no ozone layer, the atmosphere is thin enough that cosmic rays, everything is coming down, bombarding the surface. And so some shelter is probably in order for, because most organic compounds are going to have relatively weak bonds, like DNA is not the most tightly bound molecules that exist, that there's going to have to be some shelter to screen away the majority of the high energy radiation. Okay, that makes sense. Let's see.
That is actually the ExoMars rover, Rosalind Franklin, which is supposed to launch in 2022, is actually going to have a drill to be able to go down about 2 meters to get farther beneath the surface to look for material that could be preserved from.
So when is that one going to launch?
2022.
Okay, because the last mission, didn't they just have a mission that landed there and they tried to drill down and they were only able to get some fraction of the depth?
Oh yeah,
I think it was for a temperature. Yeah, InSight.
Yeah. I haven't totally followed that, but yeah, so that this will be the Rosalind Franklin rover.
Okay, I assume that they learned a lot of lessons from InSight.
I'm sure.
To watch out for the caliche on Mars.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so someone mentioned that Spirit and Opportunity bounced around inside inflated airbags like Sojourner did. So that was the end of the road for that particular technology. Okay, so what in the Mars science community, are you willing to speak about people's opinions on human spaceflight to Mars and other ideas that are proposed by technology and technology people on the Earth?
I think there's a lot of interest in human exploration of Mars, and I think that sample return makes a really good first step, because returning the samples will be the first time that samples are launched off of another planet, and so you would surely want to do that, at least once before you send humans to a planet, to launch them back. And so that would be a great trial run there with the samples. Humans can do, the rovers are amazing, but humans can do, as scientists can just do things that are so effective, scientifically. And so I think there's a lot of interest in human exploration. And
is the Mars scientific community of two minds on that, or has it kind of coalesced more around support for human exploration? Because most of my interaction with people at NASA is through astrophysics, because that's exoplanets kind of grew up in the astrophysics division, and so it's a different. I'm learning more and more that it's a different group of people that does planetary science versus the people whose shoulders I've rubbed. So, is there still much debate, or are people coming around to the idea of human space exploration on Mars, or was it never really an issue that was discussed in some detail?
I probably can't fully communicate all the the history within the community. I was part of an IMOST report. So what is it? International Mars Sample Return. I don't remember what it stands for, but basically it was, like what we talked about, laying out what are the big picture questions, before sample return. And a couple of the topics related to human exploration. So there was, history of Mars, search for life, past water on Mars and so forth. And then there was, hazards for human exploration, and there was, in situ resource utilization for humans. So, it's definitely a point of conversation, a point of research, an area of motivation. So to what extent that's a consensus view, I don't know, but but it's certainly, present, present throughout the community.
And then, do you know much about, because one of the things, a guy that I went to high school with was working in Alabama at Huntsville on how do you power a space station on the moon and on Mars. And so he ended up going off on his own going off on his own and starting a company to look at nuclear, like reinvest into some of the next generation of nuclear reactors. And so he was talking about, when you're certainly on the surface of the moon, there's a lot of thorium that's available, and so you could develop nuclear reactors on the moon. Do the Mars missions as they exist now, do they often talk about like how do we power spacecraft, or if we need more power than what we can currently deliver through the solar panels? Because most Mars missions are powered by solar energy, where kind of the deep space ones seem to be powered more by the RTGs, what are they, radio thermal something. Is there much discussion about energy sources and things like that go on with these missions, maybe to prepare for manned missions?
I think the topic that I've heard more about has been water. So in terms of water needs for human exploration, and so people have been looking at ice and so forth. And so that's what I've heard. There are particular kinds of wells that people use, and I forget what they're called, but use in Antarctica, where you pump down warm water and it melts the ice, and so you can pump up more water. And so people are investigating the possible use of something like that to obtain water on the surface of Mars. So that's what I've come into contact more.
Is there much evidence for like a permafrost on Mars's surface, or does the water really only exist on the poles?
There was evidence of liquid ice, and then the formation of brines by the Phoenix lander. And so it was able to basically scraped in the soil and saw evidence for ice, and then some seemed to liquefy and form a brine drop on the surface. So there was evidence for ice and the formation of liquid brines by the Phoenix lander. And
that was just at some arbitrary latitude. That wasn't specifically.
It was a little farther north, but I don't remember exactly where it was. Yeah.
All right, let's see. What else do we have? Do we think that there might be underwater pools beneath the surface pools of water, or do you think that it's all frozen?
That's a good question. There's certainly data that people have interpreted as resulting from evidence of subsurface brines. I don't know that there's community consensus on that, but certainly some people argue that that's what the data indicate.
Okay. All right. Do you know anything about other international missions that are planning on going to Mars?
Oh, I have not been following those as closely as I should be. I'm most familiar with ExoMars, so I have some collaborators on ExoMars, and there's a fair number of people who are on both Perseverance and the ExoMars Rosalind Franklin mission that's going to launch in 2022. So that's the one I'm most familiar with. I have talked to. I know there are others, but I haven't really been following them.
Okay. So I guess as a final part, what are you most looking forward to learning once you're able to get some sleep at the end of the 90 days and the data start pouring in? What are you most interested in learning that's, I guess, in general, or that's directly related to your science?
Well, I'm very interested in anything directly related to my science. I think the thing that I'm most interested in is what we're going to be most surprised about that we have no idea, that we don't even know. Because I feel like every mission there's something that we learn that we had no idea. For example, MSL Curiosity, it turns out that they're X-ray amorphous materials. So that means that they don't have a long-term crystalline structure present in every sample that's been measured. No one had any idea about that before
so
the XRD.
What was that again? It's
X-ray amorphous. So it doesn't have a long-term crystalline structure.
So it's like a glass kind of?
Yeah, could be a glass. Yeah, and it's probably some of them are secondary phases resulting from interaction of liquid water. And so poorly crystalline, secondary precipitates. and we had no idea until it landed. And there have been similar, Phoenix was the first to show, definitively show the carbonates, the evidence for carbonates. And so there's, there are things we're going to learn that we don't even know what we don't know. And that's really what I'm most excited about.
How much data is being collected by the mission? Like how big is the pipe that you have to send it down to get all the data back to the Earth?
I should remember the numbers on that. I do not remember. I do know, I'm as I learn how the plans are put together, I know the data volume is a concern, the energy is a concern, time is a concern. And so, putting together the plans that fit within what's possible for all of those. Right now, and everybody can see this on the website. There are huge numbers of pictures coming down. You can see all the images. And so it's a lot of data. I don't know the numbers.
So here's a question that's kind of related to that. What is the relative scientific value of the pictures compared to like the spectra or the things that I guess mass spectrometry or things like that?
I probably should have said images, because that a lot of the images also have spectral data, so they're multispectral images. So I should have said images. So there's navigation cameras and there's hazard cameras, and then there's images, but they often they have multispectral data, so they have spectral data as well.
Okay, so the images, the pictures that the typical person sees of Mars, that's like the tip of the iceberg, and the bulk of the data is going to be something that is less picturesque but maybe more information rich.
Yeah, there's going to be chemistry, mineralogy, there's even sound. I don't know if you were the ability to listen as the from the SuperChem instrument as the laser hits a rock, to hear that as well.
Really?
So you can
Wow.
even hear sounds. Yeah, you can even hear sounds from Mars.
What would you get from that?
So I'm not the expert. My understanding is it can tell you about the property of the rock that's being hit with the laser, but I'm
like if it shatters as opposed to crumbles, or like it's like listening to someone bite into a cookie. You can tell if they overcooked it or something.
I imagine it's like that. Yeah.
Okay, well that's pretty cool. So that's really fascinating. I'm first of all, I'm happy for you and for the other members of the science team, and congratulations to both you and Aria for getting able to be on board when it happens. So I really appreciate your time. And is there a place that people should look for results coming from your laboratory?
Let's see. Yeah, I have a website, Google Scholar also. So probably my website would be the best place to look, and of course, Lunar and Planetary Science Conference is where we present every year, and so there's always a lot of new data being presented there as well. As well as, and then of course, the images are almost immediately uploaded to the NASA website. So from the instruments, they can look at the data almost immediately. Okay,
so next spring, when the next Lunar and Planetary Science Conference comes up, that'll be the real breakout opportunity for the mission to present some great results. Okay, very good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for your time. I really appreciate you coming on.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. It was great.
All right. We'll see you around. Bye.
Talk to you later. Bye.